y'all, let's sew up an everyday shirt. This is a youth size. I'm using this cotton spandex as my main fabric. I have a front, a back, two sleeves cut mirror image, and then I'm using this scrap of gray for my neckband. So we're going to grab our back and front, put them right sides together, and the first thing we're going to sew up is the shoulders. You can use pin or clips. Make sure they're staying nice and perfectly together on the edges. I'm going to be using my serger to sew this up. You can certainly do this on your sewing machine if you do not have a serger. Just need a stretch stitch. My favorite one kind of looks like an E. Not all sewing machines have them though. I know a lot of people like the lightning looking stitch as well. Just take some scraps and figure out what you like. It needs to stretch as much as your fabric stretches. So since the everyday shirt is a pretty snug fit, you're most likely using high stretch fabrics, so you need a pretty stretchy stitch. If you're using a serger, it should be perfectly fine. Using a 4 thread stitch right here. You can use a 3 thread if you want. You don't need to. It's not that snug. It's not as snug as, say, a swimsuit or leotard or anything like that. It's not tight, just fitted and snug. Once we're done sewing up the shoulders, we're going to press the seams towards the back, and then we're going to open up our shirt just like this, right sides up. We're going to grab our sleeve. We're going to make sure that the back notch with the double notch is toward the back arm side and the single notch is toward the front. And then we're going to do the center notch on the sleeve cap that lines up with the shoulder seam. So we're going to pin there first, right sides together, and then go to the armpit and kind of pin our corners there. Now we're going to ease this sleeve in. There shouldn't be much ease here. On knit shirts, there's not the same amount of ease as a non-stretch fabric. It depends on the stretch to kind of give you that movement and ease. So it's going to be 1-to-1 here, but they are kind of opposite curves. So it kind of feels like you're easing it in. But you shouldn't need to stretch your arm side, and you shouldn't need to stretch your sleeve cap. So the arm side is kind of the armhole on the main shirt. Your sleeve cap is that top area of your sleeve piece. One way, if you're having a hard time kind of easing that in, is to kind of make it the shape it's going to be when it's on you. Kind of curve that arm side into a upside down U shape, and your sleeve will naturally fit into it a little bit easier. I like to stitch with my sleeve down. That's because if there is one that is easing into the other, it's the sleeve cap into your arm side. So that will help. Whatever's on the bottom while you're stitching is touching the feed dogs, the little piece on your sewing machine or serger that moves the fabric through the machine. So whatever's on the bottom naturally moves through the machine slightly faster. So if you're ever doing anything where one is longer and you're easing it into the other, you always want the longer one on the bottom. There we go. Now we can flip it out and be impressed with ourselves sewing that 3D shape from our 2D pieces, and we're just going to repeat on the other side. If you're stitching on a sewing machine and your fabric is getting a little stretched out and wavy, which is common if you're using a sewing machine that is on the lower end price range, because they do not have the ability to change the pressure on the foot. If your sewing machine can change foot pressure, you want to lighten it when you're sewing stitches. If it doesn't, just make sure you have a really light hand feeding it through. You're not stretching your fabric as it's going through, because that will make it worse. That will amplify the problem. You can also get a walking foot for your machine. They're usually not expensive, and they will help kind of guide the fabric through on the top and the bottom, so it's not putting as much pressure and it's not stretching as it is going through. If you don't have that, you don't want to wait for one, you don't want to order one. If your machine came with a Teflon foot, that also helps a little bit. It helps slide through. It's not as good as a walking foot, but if you're in a bind and you need some help, that will help. You can also use something like tissue paper or even regular paper to help feed it through. If you're having trouble, if say you're using a fabric that is really not wanting to work with you, I do recommend using something a little more stable as you're getting used to working with knit fabrics. If you are new and struggling, cotton spandex does tend to be pretty easy to work with. It's not quite as forgiving and fit as some. It tends to do better with tight fit versus just fitted to snug. Another one that is pretty easy is a t-shirt knit or tri-blend. These have cotton in them, so they make them a little more stable, but they also have some poly or rayon in them that makes them soft. So that softness helps with fitting being a little more forgiving. Next, we're going to press a memory hem into our sleeves if you're doing short sleeve or the long sleeve hem. So you just go to your iron and press that 3/4 of an inch to the wrong side. Then we're going to unfold it. As you see, I skipped the memory hem just to make this video a little quicker. In general, I love pressing a memory hem though. It's so much easier to press in the flat before you sew it in a circle, especially on a youth small size. It's just easier that it's not a tiny little circle, right? We're going to sew up the side seams now. So I'm matching up the bottom of my shirt, the armpit of my shirt, and then the bottom of my sleeves, whether that's the short sleeve like mine or the longer sleeve. I always prefer to sew from the bottom of the shirt up through the armpit. It's a personal preference. I like these seams at the armpit either both pressed up away. Sometimes I do nest them, meaning one presses up and one presses down. For the most part, I like them both pressed away from my armpit. If you like those seams pressed down, you can always sew from the sleeve down the armpit. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter. I do like to sew them the same. So if I sew from the bottom to the top on my left side, I like to sew from the bottom to the top on my right side as well. Just makes everything nice and symmetrical. All right, next we're going to work on the neckband. I mark my center front and center back by doing a little notch when I cut out my pieces. Since the pieces are on the fold, it's so quick and easy to add a little notch. I always do on my necklines and on my neckbands. I think it's so much quicker and easier than finding the center front and center back after I've sewn things up. Now I'm finding the quarter points. Remember, those shoulder seams are not ever the quarter points, hardly ever, unless your necklines are exactly the same on the front and the back, which is pretty rare. Then the shoulder seams are not the quarter points. Align your front and back and then walk the neckline around to find these. And I noticed that I got one of them off a little bit, so I'm just going to make sure they're even. As you can see, mine are off a little bit. I just went right in the middle. They were only off by maybe 1/8 of an inch, but just make it even, nice and symmetrical, right? Here's my neckband. It's folded right sides together. You can see that notch on one side where I cut it out on a fold. I'm going to sew up the short side so now it's a circle or a tube. And then we're going to fold it right sides together And we're going to mark this into even quarter points as well. Picking the right kind of fabric for your neckband is important. This one I do not have a cotton spandex for. It's not the same as my shirt. It is a modal fabric, so it's a little bit softer than my main fabric. If your neckband is softer or stretchier than your main fabric, it's perfectly fine, but you never want to go the other way. If you have a soft, lightweight, super stretchy main fabric and you use a more stable or thicker or less stretchy neckband, it's never going to lay very nicely. So you either want to use the same fabric if it is stretchy, stretchy enough for a neckband. The reason why you need a stretchy neckband is because you have to stretch it to fit the neckline. So I'm just lining up my back seam on my neckband to my back center notch, and we're just going to line all these quarter points, right? Pin or clip them together. The reason why you have to stretch your neckband to fit is if you think about the width of your neckband, it needs to be as small as the smallest inner circle at the very top of the neckband. But the bottom of the neckband needs to stretch to that wider circle where it attaches to the shirt. So the thicker or wider the neckband is, the more it's going to need to stretch to make sure that it fits both the wider part where it's attached to the shirt and still is snug to the body on the folded inner part of the circle. This is a pretty average neckband on the everyday shirt. It's not super thick, it's not super thin. Should be nice and easy to attach. Once you have attached it to the 4 corner points, you're just going to evenly stretch it between and pin or clip as much as you need in between. I stick one clip in between on this youth size that I'm doing. It's kind of a big youth size. It's a size 10. So it's getting up there on the size chart. Again, if there's anything you're doing where one is longer or shorter than the other, you want to put the longer one on the bottom. So you want the shirt on the bottom while you're sewing. And we're just going to stitch around this whole circle, the whole neckband attaching. And we're going to stretch the neckband just enough to fit the shirt. We don't want to stretch the shirt at all. One tip too on getting a nice even neckband is making sure once you've aligned your edges on this right side, what I watch after making sure I get my seam allowance correct is I watch the left side of my foot. And that's my kitty cat needing some attention. I watch the left side of my foot to make sure my band is staying the same width throughout the neckband. That's one mistake I see for beginners is they have a hard time maintaining this width. But if you can see, I have about 1/4 inch on the side of my sewing foot, and that's where my eye is to keep it even. Okay, it's easier to maintain that width right there than it is to make sure my blade is hitting the correct spot, if that makes sense. And I do the same thing on my sewing machine as well. So once we're all the way around, we can flip our shirt right sides out again, and we're going to give this a really nice press. If there's anything you don't want to skip on a t-shirt, it's pressing the neckband. You need to press this neckband. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press all my hems too because I didn't do the memory hems. I am showing top stitching and hemming on my sewing machine just in case you don't have a cover stitch. I usually do mine on my cover stitch because I'm lucky enough to have one, but I wasn't when I first started sewing. So here is how I would hem it if I didn't have one. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch. You can use any stretch stitch that you like the look of. Actually, my favorite one is usually the triple step zigzag, but I used a really basic one here because every machine has a basic zigzag usually. I like to widen mine just a couple of notches here. Make sure you reverse a little bit at the front and back. And you want your needle on the very edge of that raw edge that you flipped up right here. You don't want a lot of fabric hanging out that isn't within your stitch. Okay? And we're just going to keep going. Once again, you don't want to stretch your fabric as it's sewing. You don't even want to pull it taut. You really want the fabric feeding through your sewing machine with the least amount of pressure as possible. Because even if you do that, if you can't change the pressure foot on your machine, which a lot of beginners sewing machines can't, it's gonna give it a little bit of a wave. And I'll show you right here. It's a little stretched out, but this is nothing that a nice press can't handle. If it starts getting super wavy, that's where you're gonna have a hard time. Okay, I'm gonna show you how I would top stitch this neckline. You do not have to top stitch your neckline. If your sewing machine is struggling feeding the fabric through, you don't have a walking foot, you can't change the pressure, don't worry about it. Do not top stitch. You're fine. You don't need to. This is a nice, thick, traditional neckband, so even if the seam allowance flips up, it's not going to show. So just, you can skip it and it will be perfectly fine. I used to skip top stitching neckbands all the time when I only had a sewing machine because I thought it looked worse after I top stitched than better. Now that I have a cover stitch, I almost always top stitch just because I like the way it feels when the seam allowance doesn't move around. But again, this is optional. You don't have to top stitch if you're struggling with it. You can also use a twin needle if you only have a sewing machine and you really want that double stitch line look. They're really easy to use. You can get them in different widths, how far the needles are set apart, and you put it in your machine just like you do any other needle. Definitely check out your sewing machine's manual on how to thread it. It's not difficult though. I've had a few sewing machines throughout the years and it was never difficult to figure out from the manual. And it has 2 threads. It looks like a cover stitch, so 2 threads side by side that look like a straight stitch, and then underneath is a zigzag. So unlike 2 straight stitches, it will stretch. Okay, you are not going to be able to do a straight stitch on here because this is a fitted snug shirt. When you go to put it on, your seams are going to pop if you try to use a straight stitch. A lot of times too, I see it recommended if you're using it, you can use a straight stitch when sewing stretch fabrics sometimes, especially if it's not a fitted garment. You can stretch the fabric while you're sewing it just a little bit so it has a little bit of give and then just iron it after to get any waviness out. But this garment is fitted enough that if you try to sew it with a straight stitch or you try to hem it with a straight stitch, not only is it going to feel much tighter because your stitches aren't stretching with the fabric, but you're probably going to pop them. It's a little too tight, too fitted, too snug to get away with any straight stitches on here. You're going to have to use a stretch stitch. Let me note here too, I'm sewing from the right side. I'm so used to using my cover stitch where you can sew from the underside perfectly fine. And it is probably easier for a beginner to sew from the underside as well because you can see exactly where that raw edge is, where you need to align your stitches. We're going to move on to the bottom hem. We already pre-pressed it. That is very, very important. Make sure you don't skip that. pre-press your hems. It makes a huge difference, especially if you're a beginner. It makes it so much easier. And even if you're not a beginner, if you've gotten in the habit of not pre-pressing your hems, just know they're always going to look better. If you take the time to pre-press them, they're going to be more even, they're going to be more crisp. It's going to be easier to sew. I know it takes some time to get up, go to the iron and pre-press, but you're going to press it. You're going to press it anyways. I hope you're going to press it anyways. And here I am doing the little trick of lifting up the pressure foot. I always do it around seams to help kind of jump over that seam. But here I am doing that little trick. I just put my finger under my foot, and again, I don't lift it all the way up, but I just put a little pressure there to try to take off some of the pressure on the fabric. It's a little trick someone shared, and I can't remember who shared it with me along the years. It's been a really long time. So I can't remember if it was my mom, one of my sisters. I don't know. But give it a press, and I'll show you the difference that a quick press does. And all the waviness is gone after you give it a nice press. Another reason using cotton fabric like cotton spandex, cotton t-shirt knits are easier is because they can take a high heat on the iron, which makes pressing really nice and easy. I hope this helped if you are a beginner, and if you're not a beginner, I hope you just had fun sewing along with me. Don't forget to share. I love to see your makes.